continent and the globe, this is Africa Speaks here on Pan-African television, the show where Africa speaks for herself, loud and unfiltered. The voice you don't hear on prime time, the truths that can't be buried, the struggles that remind us that we are one people with one cause. My name is Makiza Latifa. Welcome to the show. This week, our hearts and eyes turn to Sudan, a nation caught in the grip of a devastating crisis. So what began as a political transition has spiraled into a brutal conflict, with millions displaced, cities under siege, and a people abandoned by the world. But we refuse to look away. We refuse to be silent because Sudan is not just a headline. It is a front line of a deeper battle for sovereignty and for peace, as well as justice in Africa. And so our theme this week is the crisis in Sudan, resistance, and matters alike. To help us understand how we got here and what's really at stake, we begin our show with a spotlight segment. Here's an in-depth explainer on the situation at hand.
Good evening and welcome to Spotlight on Africa Speaks. In today's segment, we turn our gaze to the tragedy that the world has chosen to forget, a war that continues to bleed silently across the heart of Northeast Africa. In its third year, the war in Sudan and the hunger, disease, the abandonment has caused record havoc in the lives of millions. The war between the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF, that began in April 2023, has led to one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Over 13 million Sudanese have been displaced. 30 million, equivalent to two-thirds of the nation's population, needs humanitarian aid. Children are the biggest casualty. Half of those displaced are hungry and underaged. The UN says it cannot reach over 80% of the children in need due to severe funding shortages. Deadly diseases are spreading, especially cholera, which has claimed over 2,000 lives. The Darfur region is the worst affected, with famine having been declared in the Zamzam refugee camp in North Darfur province. The RSF has been besieging El Fasher, the capital of the province. The UN has warned that the people are facing famine there too. It is important to remember the history of the war. In 2019, Trade Union and the People's Movement, along with the left, overthrew the regime of dictator Omar al-Bashir, the leader of the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces. Once Lieutenant of Bashir quickly denounced him and entered into an uneasy agreement with certain civilian forces. The Sudanese left and People's Movement warned that peace and justice would be elusive as long as the military and parliamentary forces had a role in government. However, the international community saw these generals as their solution and continued to engage with them. In 2021, the Army Chief General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and the RSF Chief General Hamdan Dagalo, or Hamdit, overthrew the civilian government, but difference between the two soon led to the civil war breaking out for over 2 years ago. Countries in the region have played a key role in continuing of the war. The UAE has been vital for the RSF, supplying them with weapons. A lot of Sudanese gold is processed through the UAE, and Sudan plays a key role in the Emirates' strategic calculation in the region. Egypt and Saudi Arabia backed the Sudanese army. Both sides have been accused of human rights violation and war crimes. If there's anyone on the right side of history, it is the people and their movement, the Sudanese Communist Party, the thousands of neighborhood resistance committee, the trade union, and many others who have consistently demanded a future free of generals and tried their very best to ensure relief reaches the people. However, their voices is ignored by the international community, which continues to engage with the generals. Fighting has intensified in the Darfur and Kordofan. Both sides have announced their own governments, and experts fear that there is a possibility of the country being partitioned. Many issues are yet to be resolved. This includes what is the sustainable way to ensure an end to the fighting and justice? What will the impact of the two separate governments be? Will foreign players such as UAE permit an end to the fighting in Sudan? We will address all these questions in these episodes. Please stay tuned for more insights. You're watching Africa Speaks.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for laying the foundation and helping us grasp the depth of the Sudanese crisis. A crisis rooted not just in conflict, but in the long, bitter legacy of militarism, foreign interference, and betrayal. And now we take the conversation deeper in our Expert Speak segment, where we bring in voices from the front lines of thoughts, of resistance, and of storytelling. So joining us today is a powerful voice in the progressive media space, Ahmed Kaballo, journalist and founder of African Stream, a platform that has boldly challenged Western narratives, exposed media bias, and elevated African agency. As a Sudanese activist and journalist, Ahmed has not only reported on the crisis, he's actually lived it, resisted it, and he continues to raise his voice for a free and sovereign Sudan.
Thank you for having me on the show. Thank you for covering this much neglected story that's happening in the African continent, what the UN describes as the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and that's the situation in Sudan. My name is Ahmed Kaballo. I'm a Sudanese heritage, born in the UK, but living in Kenya, Nairobi. I am the former founder and CEO of the now defunct African Stream, which was a Pan-African digital media outlet. Now, the situation in Sudan is a very dire situation. The war started in April 15th, 2023, but in reality, the situation started a long time ago before then. It started in its modern manifestation with the downfall of Omar al-Bashir, the former dictator of Sudan. To maintain power, he propped up this paramilitary force, which is known as the Rapid Support Forces, but was previously known as the Janjaweed. And the reason for that was twofold. Firstly, it was to quell an uprising in Darfur in 2003. But after that, he thought if he was able to have a kind of private militia force under the command of Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, aka Hemeti, which Hemeti itself means my protector. It was a name that Bashir gave Hemeti. He thought that he would be safe from a coup. He thought the army will never turn against me because there's this huge force which has up to 100,000 men that will defend me to the hilt. What he didn't envision was that the head of the armed forces and the head of the Rapid Support Forces would combine together and topple Bashir in a coup and take control. So they took control of the country after Bashir fell. Their plan was to jointly lead the country, but there was obviously huge rivalries between both camps. Burhan, the head of the armed forces, was uneasy with having this huge armed to the teeth paramilitary force in the country's capital. And so what he tried to do was incorporate the Rapid Support Forces within the army. Of course, this received pushback from Hemeti. Hemeti says, we will do it, but we'll do it within a decade. Burhan says, no, it needs to be done immediately within the year. And that's what the essence of the fighting is. And the reason for that is, of course, it's about the spoils of Sudan's wealth. Hemeti had become, under Bashir's reign, one of the richest men in Sudan. Bashir gave him access to two of the biggest gold mines in Sudan. A lot of this gold was being smuggled illegally to the United Arab Emirates, which was making Hemeti and his men a lot of money. And he knew if he was to be incorporated within the Sudanese army, that would threaten his wealth and it would also threaten the importance that he has for the proxy forces, such as the United Arab Emirates in the region. So that's essentially what the fight is. It's about greed, it's about power, it's about who gets to siphon off the access to the ports in Sudan, the access to the gold mines, the access to the agricultural land in Sudan, who gets to control what. And what we're seeing right now with the announcement of a rival government, which happened right here in Nairobi, Kenya, um, it looks like Sudan is heading towards a Libya-style partition of the country, with the rapid support forces controlling places like Darfur, Kordofan, and then the Sudanese army controlling, the capital, Omdurman, Bahri and Khartoum, as well as Al Jazeera State and Port Sudan. And that would be a disaster for everyone in the country, and that's what we're trying to avoid. But it looks like both men are willing to fight to the hill, and they're both being backed by foreign powers, so they can continue fighting as long as the arms continue to flow to the Sudanese army and to the rapid support forces. So the Sudanese army is currently being armed by Russia, Turkey, Iran, and Egypt. The Rapid Support Forces is being armed by the UAE and its proxy client states within the African region. So those arms coming through Chad, they're coming through allegedly Kenya, Uganda, allegations of even South Sudan, and of course Ethiopia. And the UAE is very interested in Sudan for many reasons. The gold, which I mentioned, the UAE is the number one destination for gold from Africa illegally smuggled into the UAE. It's also very interested in the ports. So if you look at the UAE's actions within Africa, right now it's involved in Ethiopia in its conflict with Somalia, and pushing Ethiopia to recognize Somaliland, again because it's concerned about these ports. It's of course interested in Yemen, which is also the other side of the Red Sea, where it waged a war with Saudi Arabia a few years back, but it still has significant interest in that region. So it's trying to consolidate power. It's been supporting General Haftar in Libya for several years right now. So I think it's clear that the UAE's entrance into the treasure box that is Africa seems to be via the east of Sudan, Chad, Ethiopia, and slightly inwards via Libya. So the RSF, which I mentioned previously, used to be called the Janjaweed, which roughly translate to jinn on horse, and they come from the Darfur region. So this is the kind of home ground. So that's why they want to consolidate their power in the Darfur region. Now, the RSF come from Arab nomadic tribes, and they've for centuries lived in peace with the Four tribe and the other so-called African tribes. I say so-called because, in my opinion, they're all African. But in the 80s, as we saw issues of climate change, desertification, the resources and the grazing ground that the nomadic tribes had relied on became more scarce. Then it led to obvious conflicts with some of the established groups there. And so when these groups started to, rightfully so, express their annoyance and frustration with the central government in Khartoum over decades of marginalization, of decades of economic neglect, decades of political isolation. Instead of addressing these issues like a responsible government should have, the Sudanese army decided to use these grievances between the nomadic Arab tribes and the established African tribes, and basically started to arm what would be the Janjaweed against these tribes, which led to the Darfur genocide that happened, which led to the mass displacement, and so Darfur has never really received justice post 2003, 2005 when the war was happening until now. Millions of people from Darfur have been spread around the world. There's a huge community in Birmingham, in England, where I used to live. So there's always been this kind of very fragile peace, if you can call it peace. Um, so when the war started, the RSF used the excuse of the war to re-establish and reaffirm its dominance in that region. And it sees Darfur, because of the rich gold in the region, as what would be the capital of its de facto partition part of the state. So that's why it's become such a hotbed of violence, because it recognizes if it loses Khartoum, which it did a couple of months ago, that Darfur will be the center of the RSF's power base and military base. The Rapid Support Forces is a gun for hire mercenary group. Yeah, it
Mm,
was used by the Sudanese army to quell the uprising in Darfur, but it was also used by the Saudis and the UAE in their war on Yemen. So the Saudis and UAE were paying people in Darfur, young fighters uh, affiliated with the Janjaweed, to go and fight in the Saudi-led war on Yemen, to fight against the Houthis in a war that had nothing to do with Sudanese people. Um, and then it was used when there was protests in 2014. Bashir brought in people from the Rapid Support Forces, the aka Janjaweed, to shoot and quell protesters, because he felt like the army come from the same community as the protesters, so they were a little bit less ruthless than the Rapid Support Forces. I say all that to say they wouldn't fight if they weren't being paid to fight, and
yeah,
they wouldn't fight unless they continue to have weapons and arms. These are non-ideological mercenaries. They don't have any ideology, they don't have any political position beyond who
sure.
pays me, who
Mm,
pays me, I'll continue to define. That's number one. The question of why they haven't stopped fighting is because their paymasters haven't told them to stop, but also because I think the long-term aim of the Rapid Support Forces is to establish enough land under their control and consolidate
mm,
that land under their control, and then use that to go into negotiations. Right now, I don't think they're content with, just having Darfur and parts of Kordofan. I think they want, if not a 50-50 split, then at least a 60-40. Right now, it's probably about 75% under the Sudanese army control and 25% under the Rapid Support Forces control. That's not a split that they're happy with, especially because the land that they control has no access to the sea. And as I mentioned before, the United Arab Emirates is very concerned with the ports that give access to the Red Sea. Um, but they don't want the war to stop. I say that because the Sudanese army, its biggest backer from the start has been Egypt. The Rapid Support Forces, its biggest backer and its most significant backer has been the United Arab Emirates. Both of these are principal US allies. Egypt is probably number one ally of the United States in the region of Africa. The UAE is one of the top allies in West Asia, what they call the Middle East, for the United States. All it would take is one phone call from Donald Trump or one phone call from Joe Biden, his predecessor, and this war could end. If he says to the UAE, if you don't stop backing the Rapid Support Forces, we're going to cut off diplomatic ties, political ties, and military support, they would stop, because the UAE relies on the US for its defense. Yeah. If he called Egypt, which has the biggest military budget in the whole of Africa and it receives most of its military funding from the US, and said, if you don't force the Sudanese army to the negotiating table, then we're gonna cut off funding. They would do that. The Sudanese army refuses to even negotiate with the rapid support forces. So when they say the international community, the Sudanese people are sick and tired of that term. It's international imperialism, and imperialism has no desire to stop this war. I think there was discussion of a Russian naval base in the Red Sea in Port Sudan, and that really angered the US. We saw the US special envoy and the US ambassador saying that if they go ahead with this Russian naval base, there'll be huge disasters for Sudan. And I think they're happy to see Sudan destroyed, and it will teach the Sudanese people a lesson about who they will and won't do business with when it comes to their port access. That's my assessment. Because like I said, they could have stopped this war within the first month. Here we are, 2.5 years later. We have a cholera outbreak, 60,000 cases of cholera. We have at least 150,000 people killed, according to the US Special Envoy. I predict the number to be much greater than that. We have 25 million people facing acute hunger, over 650,000 people facing famine. We've seen videos on social media of Sudanese women praying for food, praying for help. Women are forced to feed their children cockroaches because there's no food. It's a terrible, terrible, terrible situation that every Sudanese person in the diaspora, like myself, knows somebody that has died, know somebody that's been displaced, know somebody that's suffering. We don't even jump on video calls with family members because it's too heartbreaking to see how thin they've got. It's a terrible situation, and they could stop it if they wanted to. The position of the Sudanese left, and I agree with this position, they don't support either group. They argue that the Rapid Support Forces is a product of the Sudanese army. It was birthed by the Sudanese army. So to now the Sudanese army is trying to portray itself as the saviors of Sudan, when in reality they're the architects of our downfall, of our war. Because if we didn't prop up the rapid support forces to fight in Darfur, to fight in Yemen, to quell protesters, we wouldn't have this problem. And after Bashir fell, had it have truly handed over power to a civilian-led government and not insisted on a power sharing agreement, we wouldn't be in this problem. So they don't support either side. However, they do agree that the Sudanese army at this particular stage is the lesser of two evil, because right now it seems like the Rapid Support Forces is willing to sell most of Sudan that it takes under control to the UAE. The Sudanese army, yes, the support that it's receiving from Iran and Russia and Turkey will come with conditions, but it doesn't mean that we're going to have to give up ports. It doesn't mean that we have to give up our gold mines. It doesn't mean we're going to have to give up our sovereignty. So they see that the argument is we will deal with the Sudanese army at a later point, but right now we're in an existential crisis with the rapid support forces, and that existential crisis is what we need to deal with. I'm trying to be as polite as possible when I say this. Not very much. Not very much at all. And Sudanese people have been very frustrated with that fact, because Sudanese people have always supported liberation struggles around the world, have always supported when there's been a humanitarian crisis. And it feels like when it's our time of need, it's just the Sudanese diaspora that are acting. It's just the Sudanese diaspora that are going out and trying to raise money, that are raising the flag. The left barely talk about Sudan. I'll get a few invitations when there's an anniversary on April the 15th, but by and large, no one even talks about what's going on there. So it's been very frustrating. There has been some solidarity. Some networks like Breakthrough News have done very well in covering Sudan and constantly keeping it on the radar. People's Assembly and others. But apart from that, it's been little and very far between in terms of coverage, in terms of support, in terms of solidarity. I think there's a few reasons for that. Number one, it's not a very easy conflict to understand. When it comes to Gaza, we have the obvious bad guys, which is Israel, and the good guys, which is the Palestinians. In Sudan, we have the lesser of two evils. So that could be one of the reasons. Of course, conflict, it's much more difficult to mobilize support when it's Africans killing Africans. So because it's a conflict between the Sudanese army, which is African, and the Rapid Support Force, which is African, um, um, at least they might not identify as African, but they're African. Because it's so-called black on black violence, it's difficult to mobilize again. But I think it's all excuses. This is the world's worst humanitarian crisis. We should be getting billions and billions of people mobilizing, raising their voice. We should have billions of support. We can't raise the money needed to meet the bare minimum needs of the Sudanese people. And I'll be honest, it breaks my heart, and it breaks the hearts of millions of Sudanese people who, like I've said, have always been on the forefront, on the front line of supporting other struggles. Yeah, I mean, we need your support. We need your support. The revolutionary groups on the ground are the community-led groups. They're not only providing support in community kitchens. One of the community kitchens I've been raising money for in North Khartoum have just built a water well, and we managed to raise the money for that. But now they're trying to raise money for a solar panel, and it's very slow process because basically it's primarily Sudanese people that are donating. This is a humanitarian crisis. We need humans of conscience all over the world to support us. And we need to put pressure on the centers of power, i.e., the United States, i.e., the United Kingdom, i.e., Belgium and places like that, and say, you guys need to put pressure on your allies, i.e., principally the UAE and Egypt, and there needs to be a negotiated settlement because the Sudanese people are on the brink of a crisis that they won't be able to recover from for many, many decades.
Very powerful insights from Ahmed Kaballo, reminding us that the crisis is not just political, it's actually personal. It's about people, it's about life, loss, and the daily courage to survive. And now we hand the mic to the people of Sudan themselves. This is Voices on the Ground, where we hear directly from those living through the chaos, the heartbreak, and the resistance. Listen closely. These are the voices of the people refusing to be erased.
Darfur has been an independent entity from time immemorial until 1916, when the British colonial powers invaded Darfur after the rest of Sudan. Darfur has the size of France or California of the United States. It's also composed of diversities of ethnicities, climates, and cultures, but it still is one entity that is part of Sudan. It's known as the Darfur region, administrative-wise, but it has 5 states. That is the western state. Its capital is El Jinena. The central state capital is Zalingi. Southern state's capital is Nayala. Eastern state capital is Al Dain. Then the 5th state is Al Fasha, is a north state, and its capital is Al Fasha. Today we are going to concentrate on a fascia because of the huge human catastrophe that started not only after 15 April of 2023 war, but it's the history of the prolonged war that started since the eruption of the situation in Darfur in 2003. It was a conflict between the government of Sudan and rebel movements from Darfur. Then government of Sudan and its allies, the Janjaweed Arab militias, were able to destroy more than 15,000 villages across the whole region. Again, atrocities that occurred there now are known as the most heinous crimes, or heinous crimes known as genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. More than 500,000 lives perished due to this war. Again, there were crimes that occurred in the region, like rape of women and young girls, that mean to destroy the dignity of the people of Darfur. It was an ethnic cleansing that occurred in that region, and is still occurring up to this moment. Today, we have the situation in Al Fasher that has been the capital, the historical capital of that region, and is under siege for more than 1.5 years now. That the Al Fasher city was hosting more than 1,800,000 people when the siege started. Most of the besieged people, some of them were able to flee the city, but still we have some few who are not yet able to go out of the besieged city. The situation is there. We have today the most dangerous situation when it is a combination of cholera epidemic with famine, diseases, and aerial bombardments from the government helicopter gunships and aircrafts are still happening, while the Janjaweed and their allies that are called the Rapid Support Force.
So from the ruins of war in Sudan to the rising fires of resistance across the continent, we now turn to dispatches from Africa, where we bring you sharp, urgent stories from the front lines of struggle, survival, and solidarity. This week's dispatches include the United States dumping African migrants in Swaziland, a renewed clampdown on activists in Tanzania, and Ghana's donation of cocoa products to Palestine in a show of Pan-African solidarity. Stay with us for more details.
With regards to the recent dumping of migrants in Swaziland by the governments of the United States of America, so currently there have been 5 convicted migrants who were convicted in the United States of America who were recently dumped in Swaziland late last month. So actually, some of them were convicted of rape, murder, and other violent crimes. However, we've also been able to get confidential information that it's not only the 5 migrants that will be dumped in Swaziland, but there's a secret agreement between the Prime Minister, who is acting on behalf of the King and the government of the United States of America, to dump more criminals or to dump more migrants from the United States of America in Swazi prisons. However, what is more shocking is that we've been able to uncover that almost all the migrants that have been dumped here have finished their sentences in the United States. And it's quite outrageous that they have still been dumped in Swaziland, even though they've been able to finish their sentences in the United States of America. With regards to why the government of the United States of America, is led by Trump, chose to dump them in Swaziland, it confirms our long-standing position as an organization, as the Swaziland Youth Congress, the Youth League of Pudemo, that the Swazi state is in collaboration with the West, is in collaboration with the imperial powers of the world, as led by the United States of America. And we believe that this agreement has been a cordial agreement between the two states, unfortunately. And we understand that Swaziland, the Swazi state, has been collaborating with the United States in a number of things, one of which has been supporting the Chinese province of Taiwan, which is a secessionist in its nature, and it seeks to destabilize the People's Republic of China. So there have been more collaborations between the two states. So this one has just been exposed to the front, and it has been seen to be violating the human rights of the concerned migrants, as well as also ensuring that the people of, as well as making it a point that the territorial integrity of Swaziland is being undermined, but with the permission of the Swazi states, as led by the royal family, with Swati being at the helm of the leadership position. So amidst all this, the people of Swaziland have been expressing their outrage in various forms, through petitions in various social media platforms that have been signed by several number of people, and also through practical action on the ground. So a few weeks ago, we were able to visit the embassy of the United States in Swaziland, whereby we protested against this dumping of migrants in our country, and also the violation of our territorial integrity. Unfortunately, the response was outrageous, as usual. The ambassador of the United States of America refused to meet the delegation that was there to deliver the petition. Hence, the petition delivery was postponed to another date, which we are still mobilizing to ensure that we still go again to express our outrage at the embassy, and also express our outrage to the fact that the Swazi government was able to permit this and be in agreement with the United States of America in this gross violation of human rights, which is tantamount to human trafficking, to be stated more explicitly as well. And also the undermining of our territorial integrity as a country, and also not only undermining our territorial integrity, but in a way it also undermines the security of the Southern African region and the African continent in particular, because we are not aware of the terms that were agreed upon between the two states, and we do not know what intentions, what these migrants will be serving, what intentions will be served by the Swazi states using these migrants that have been dumped here. Because we know very well that the Swazi state has been notorious for violating human rights with impunity, to an extent that we have more than 100 Swazis who are currently exiled in neighboring countries, and some who are exiled in other countries, simply for demanding democratic reforms, or for demanding democratization of Swaziland. And we also have a number of young people who are currently imprisoned in Mswati cells, and charged with terrorism, murder, sedition, and amongst other ridiculous charges, simply for demanding the democratization of Swaziland. And from this, they include 2 former members of parliament who are currently languishing in jail, who were both sentenced to more than 68 years in jail. So that is the nature of the Swazi states, and we're not surprised by the collaboration with the imperial power, which is the United States of America, because it confirms that the Swazi state has no interest of the people at heart, but its interests lie with economy, with its own, with supporting the royal family, and also ensuring that Swazis are subjugated in whatever form possible. And then, from the perspective of our organization, we believe that this is a human trafficking. It must be condemned in the highest form possible by the people of Swaziland, by all democracy-loving people of the world, by all organizations of the world who want to see the prosperity of every nation in the world. And we believe that from this, our people must continue expressing their outrage in whatever form possible regarding this move that has been taken by the Swazi states in collaboration with the US government. And we also call for human rights organizations to lend their solidarity and support to the people of Swaziland as they seek to fight this matter, as they seek to challenge this decision, both in the courts and in the streets. So in terms of the solidarity, we request solidarity in terms of messages of support, in terms of amplifying the voices of the people of Swaziland and their condemnation of this matter. And as an organization, we very much support the move that has been taken by the Lawyers for Human Rights in Swaziland that has launched a court challenge challenging this deportation of migrants in our country. And we call on all progressive organizations in the world to lend their support to the Lawyers for Human Rights and also lend people-to-people solidarity through practical solidarity with the people of Swaziland as they organize protests regarding this matter. And also we request solidarity that will go beyond this issue, because we know that Swaziland is Africa's last absolute monarchy, and it is still ruled by one man, the king, who single-handedly appoints all members of the judiciary, all members of the legislature, or all members of the executive, as well as having direct control over all members of the legislature. That means he's still ruling by decree even to this day and age. Therefore, we request for solidarity from all countries, from all states, to ensure that the Swazi states, more in particular, the Swazi royal family, the monarchy, the Dlamini royal dynasty, to be put under targeted sanctions by all countries, by all organizations, to allow for the democratization of Swaziland.
In a move that has drawn both praise and pointed questions, the current president of the Republic of Ghana, President John Dramani Mahama, has donated 40 metric tons of Ghana-made cocoa products to the people of Palestine, a humanitarian gesture aimed at providing relief to families in Gaza, especially children affected by the ongoing Israeli bombardment. The consignment, which includes golden tree chocolates, cocoa powder, and butter, was officially handed at the Jubilee House to Palestinian Ambassador Abdel Fattah al-Satari, who described the gesture as a mark of true African brotherhood. The president said the donation reflects Ghana's long-standing commitment to peace, justice, and the protection of human dignity. He reiterated Ghana's support for a negotiated two-state solution in accordance with international law. But beneath the warmth of this cocoa diplomacy lies a deeper and more uncomfortable truth. For years, Ghana's foreign policy on Palestine has remained cautiously non-aligned, often silent during moments of global outrage, from the Israeli bombing of hospitals in Gaza to the forced displacement of Palestinians in the West Bank. This cocoa gesture marks a clear shift, at least symbolically, away from the apathy of the previous administrations. It is the first visible state-led act of solidarity with Palestine in recent memory. Yet, many observers and activists are asking, is it enough? Critics argue that humanitarian aid, while necessary, cannot replace political clarity. They point to Ghana's proud anti-colonial legacy from Kwame Nkrumah's defiant stance against apartheid to Ghana's historic leadership in a non-aligned movement, and question why that legacy stops short of formally condemning Israeli occupation and apartheid policies. For many, sending chocolate is kind, but what Palestinians need is for African nations to take a position, not just provide comfort. As African countries begin to re-evaluate their alliances in a shifting global order, Ghana's gesture, though small, may signal a wider rethink, but whether this marks the beginning of true solidarity or remains a diplomatic olive branch wrapped in a sweet packaging is still uncertain. For now, cocoa arrives in Gaza, but in the halls of power and the streets of Accra, the bigger question remains: will Ghana speak not just with gifts, but with bold and political conviction?
So, speaking of the crackdown of activism in Tanzania, first of all, I think we need to understand that it's not a new phenomenon. It has been there for a very, very long time. And in my view, it has been there since the days of colonialism. And one should understand that, if you are speaking of the role of state here in Tanzania, our state originally was created in Berlin. So it still remains a colonial state up until now. So it holds the same features as colonial states, of which the colonial state itself, it never tolerated any kind of dissent. So in modern day, we can call it activism of the time. So whoever tried to, think contrary to the state narrative was hammered down. So it has been reigned as so for many, many years up until now. But recently, there's been, the crackdown of activism, but the most highlighted cases has been those of the high-profile, activists, be it the opposition leaders and the so-called, mainstream activists as so, those who belong to the civil society and so on and so forth. But in my view, if activism should carry its true weight, I think it should mean anyone who trying to fight against injustices in our society by any means necessary. So for that matter, I think even the definition of itself should be extended not just to the high-profile members of our society, to those who are normally unseen, those who are struggling against land, land grab, and so on and so forth. But the reality is, there has been recently, as we are heading towards general elections in October, there's a kind of panic within the state. So the opposition leaders, members of the NGOs and civil society has been viciously attacked by the state. There are cases of abduction, forced disappearance, and even extrajudicial killings. So there has been a resistance against it, but in my view, we should be able to extend this idea of activism to fit its true dimension, of which I think there's millions of activists there which are always not unnoticed, but they are doing a very great job that benefits us all, and we need to recognize. And in this same sense of extending solidarity to those who have been attacked, I think it is very important to do much more efforts to extend our solidarity to those who have never been recognized as activists, but what they are doing is actually activism in its true sense of the word. So that is my view. So there's that crackdown of activists, but I think we need to expand our understanding, because that does not affect only the high-profile members of our society. It also affects much more larger the members of the society that are not recognized as activists, but what they're doing is actual activism. And their suffrage has been also unnoticed. So they have been, persecuted and so on and so forth without even, a concrete a concrete solidarity to them. So I think we need to advance, our solidarity to beyond, the high-profile activists and so on and so forth. But the situation is not good as we're heading election, and the reasons can be understood. The ruling class, which is attached to our state, it is like it has panicked somehow, because the political parties they're not even boycotting it. They are like trying to stop the election, because to them there must be like fundamental reforms before we enter to the election. So they're not just boycotting it, but they want to stop the election up until their demands are being listened and addressed. So that threatens the state. So the state has opted to, to hammer them down, to batter them down, and so on and so forth. So that's the situation. But I think we're not supposed to be reactionary, to just go along with the opposition narrative, because we know the opposition, they are just, much of their reforms does not necessarily, does not necessarily speak the plight of the majority in the society. So that's it. So we need as a society, we need to extend our understanding about activism, as well as try to do much more in extending our solidarity to those who are affected by the crackdown of the state in the activism. So that's it as of now.
And next up is our word of the day, where we pause, reflect, and unpack the language that defines our struggles and our solidarity. Today's word is one that carries both pain and power. A word that speaks to the stories we've just heard from Sudan, from Swaziland, and across the continent. That word is refugee. What does it mean to be forced from your home, to carry your life in a bag, and your hope in a heartbeat? What does it mean when entire generations grow up in camps, stateless and unseen? In this moment, we ask, who gets to be called a refugee and whose displacement is ignored? Let's reflect on the word and remember the people behind it.
Who decides who belong and who must run? Who gets to write refugee on someone else's life and erase the story that forced them to flee? They won't tell you about the bombs, the boardrooms, or the borrowed guns. They won't name the banks or the generals. But the word refugee, that one, they'll repeat as if exile is a choice. And that's exactly why we are here today. This is Africa Speaks on Pan-African television, where language is political and truth is never neutral. I am Vicky Wilson, and this is your word of the day. Today's word is refugee, a word used by the powerful to mask the crimes of power. They say refugee like people just wake up and choose exile. They don't tell you who lit the match, who pulled the trigger, who signed a debt deal that turned homes into rubble, land into a battlefield, and agricultural land into staging grounds for farming. Across Africa, tens of thousands of people are displaced, not by tribalism or misfortune, but by warlords armed by the West, by IMF reforms, by climate collapse caused elsewhere but felt here. Conflicts have displaced over 45 million people in Africa. Sudan is bleeding. Over 13 million people have been displaced as generals who shot protesters and attacked democracies have turned against each other. Armed and financed by Gulf countries, which have their own strategic goals, these generals have sent soldiers against refugees. The Zanzam refugee camp, hosting around 700,000 people, was attacked time and again, forcing hundreds of thousands of people to flee for a second or third time. The nearby city of El Fasher in Darfur today faces famine. In Congo, Rwandan soldiers and their proxy militias have displaced over 1 million people since the beginning of the year, driven by their greed for gold, coltan, and cobalt, which power smartphones and electric cars across the world. Refugees made for profit. In the Sahel, imperialist foreign armies militarized the region. French and US bases ate up spaces and money for schools and farms. They were finally expelled, but their presence lingers in the armed conflict they fostered and the displacement that continues. Meanwhile, thousands die as they leave the shores of Africa in search of some stability in Europe. Over 8,000 died in migrant routes across the world in 2024. The bulk of them in Africa or in the Mediterranean. After destroying Libya and setting off Islamist insurgencies across the continent, NATO leaders now recruit Africans to jail and torture their own people to stop them from heading to Europe. When people live in ramshackle boats that become stranded in open sea, European vessels refuse even water and stop rescuers. What war does not destroy, economic does. African leaders are ordered to stop spending on schools, hospitals, and employment programs in the name of austerity and good governance. Hundreds of thousands leave their homelands for other countries where they work in deeply precarious conditions and are targeted by xenophobic forces. And there is Palestine, the longest refugee crisis of our time. The survivors of the Nakba and their descendants in the million await their return to the homeland. Meanwhile, Gaza has become one large refugee camp. Israeli leaders yearn to displace its entire population, promising Donald Trump its Rivera. But refugees are not victims. They are survivors of the empire, and Africans are not waiting to be saved. So in Burkina Faso, land has been reclaimed through revolutionary farming and self-defense. In Mali, gold has been wrestled from foreign hands. And in South Sudan, despite war, people's councils are forming to govern what the state abandoned. This is the story they don't get to tell you, not one of hopelessness, but one of resistance. We do not want pity, we want reparations and not refugee camp revolution. Pan-Africanism means no African is illegal on African soil. It means destroying the roots of displacement, war, extraction, borders, imperial militaries, and capitalist greed. The refugee is not the problem, the system is. Therefore, the solution is power in the hands of the people. So from Katome to Goma, from Tripoli to Agadez, and from Rafah to Ramallah, this is not a refugee crisis. It is a colonial crisis, and like all systems of oppression, it can and must be undone. This is your word of the day with me, Vicky Wilson. Keep watching the program.
And as we prepare to close this week's edition of Africa Speaks, we ground ourselves in memory, because to remember is to resist. For our history segment, we honor the fearless women of South Africa who on August 9th in 1956 marched in their thousands to the Union buildings in Pretoria, rising against apartheid past laws, state violence, and patriarchal oppression. It is their courage that we carry today. Their voices echo in every struggle for land, for justice, and for dignity. This is why 9th August is not just Women's Day in South Africa. It is actually a revolutionary marker for the entire continent.
August 9th is the 69th anniversary of the 1956 march by over 20,000 women in Pretoria against apartheid South Africa's policy of domestic passports, which black people were forced to carry. This was not just one march, but part of the iconic struggle against apartheid, which went on for decades. The domestic passports, known as dumpers, were an integral part of policing and exploiting the black working class. This system of exploitation was particularly harsh on black women who were left to carry the burden of apartheid dismantling of familial and social structures. In the workforce, They occupy the lowest positions and experience the highest levels of precarity and violence. This oppression did not go unchallenged. Resistance to this was fierce. Militancy and conviction of working-class women could be heard in the popular slogan, "You strike a woman, you strike a rock. You will be crushed," under the leadership of powerful organizers such as Ray Simmons, Lillian Ngozi, Amina Kachilia, and Helen Joseph. The Federation of South African Women was formed in 1954 and released a women's charter with demands such as equity of opportunity in employment, equal pay for equal work, equal rights in relations to property, marriage, and children. The women understood they were oppressed as black people, as women, and because they were poor. Their demands found an echo in a Freedom Charter released the next year, the pole star in the struggle against apartheid. The march by militant women in 1956 was a milestone in the struggle against apartheid, which were overthrown in 1994. August 9th was subsequently declared National Women's Day in South Africa. Yet to this day, the demands of Women's Charter and the dreams of those thousands of marching women have not been fulfilled. Inequality can only be abolished by abolishing capitalism and all its social and cultural institutions. Taking the lead from the gallant women fighters of the 1950s, the revolutionary task for all people today is to mobilize and organize the working class. As the women of 1956 did, our task is to unify all efforts into a political force that can launch a direct assault on the key tenets of capitalist and imperialist systems.
And that brings us to the end of this week's episode of Africa Speaks here on Pan-African Television, where the continent speaks in her own voice and on her own terms. We've listened to truth, resistance, and radical hope. I hope you enjoyed every bit of it and you have been educated and informed as well. My name is Makiza Latifa, and as always, we remind you that our liberation is not a slogan, it is a practice. It is in the way we show up, it's in the way we speak up, and it's in the way that we stand together as a people. So until next time, keep organizing, keep questioning, and keep listening, because Africa is speaking and the world must listen. Enjoy the rest of our programs.